The manila envelope in my hands felt heavier than it should have. Inside were 200 pristine wedding invitations, each one embossed with gold lettering that read, "Cassandra Mitchell and James Rodriguez request your presence." But as I stared at the return address, my blood ran cold. These weren't supposed to exist anymore. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My sister Bianca had told me she'd canceled them 3 weeks ago when she convinced me to postpone the wedding. "Trust me, Cass," she'd said, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against my kitchen counter. "James isn't ready. You'll thank me later." What she didn't tell me was that the print shop still had my order, and today they'd delivered it to my apartment by mistake. The mistake that would change everything. 6 months earlier, I was living in a studio apartment in Queens, working double shifts as a pediatric nurse while James finished his residency in cardiology. We'd been together 4 years, and when he proposed on New Year's Eve with my grandmother's ring, I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. James was everything my family approved of: ambitious, educated, from a good Puerto Rican family, and most importantly to them, he had potential for serious money. My sister Bianca had married her investment banker husband 3 years prior in a ceremony that cost more than my annual salary. She lived in a penthouse on the Upper East Side, carried handbags that could fund a small country, and never let me forget the difference in our circumstances. "You're so brave," she'd say with that patronizing smile. "Living paycheck to paycheck, working with sick children all day. I could never handle that kind of stress." But I loved my work. Every time I helped a scared 7-year-old find the courage for their surgery or comforted parents during their worst nightmare, I knew I was making a difference. James understood that. He'd find me after my hardest days and just hold me, knowing exactly what I needed without words. Planning our wedding became my escape from the hospital's fluorescent lights and constant beeping. I dreamed of a simple ceremony at the botanical garden where James had proposed, followed by dinner at the Italian restaurant where we'd had our first date. Nothing fancy, just intimate and meaningful. 200 people felt like a stretch for our budget, but both our families were large, and we wanted everyone there to celebrate with us. That's when Bianca inserted herself into every decision. "You can't serve pasta at a wedding reception, Cassandra. What will people think?" She'd appointed herself my unofficial wedding consultant, showing up at every vendor meeting with spreadsheets and opinions I hadn't asked for. "This photographer isn't high-end enough. This venue looks like a community center. These flowers are what people use for funerals." James tried to shield me from her criticism, but Bianca had a way of making her disapproval feel like family concern. "I'm just looking out for you," she'd say. "You only get married once, hopefully. Why not do it right?" The tension came to a head during what was supposed to be our final cake tasting. We'd chosen a small bakery in Astoria, run by an elderly Italian woman whose cannoli cake had made James literally moan with pleasure. Mrs. Benedetto had offered to make our wedding cake at cost because she'd watched us come in for coffee and pastry every Sunday morning for 2 years. "This place smells like old grease," Bianca announced the moment she walked in, her Louboutin heels clicking against the worn linoleum. She examined the display cases like they contained evidence of a crime. "Cassandra, you can't serve cake from here. What if someone gets food poisoning?" Mrs. Benedetto's face fell. She'd been so excited to make our cake, had even sketched out designs with little sugar flowers to match my bouquet. James stepped forward immediately. "The cake is perfect, Mrs. B. We're honored you're making it for us." But Bianca wasn't finished. "You know what your problem is, Cass? You think small. You've always thought small. That's why you're still living in that tiny apartment, working a job that barely pays your bills, planning a wedding that looks like a quinceañera from 1995. The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Benedetto busied herself wiping down already clean counters. James's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping. And me? I felt something inside me break. "Get out," I said quietly. "Excuse me?" I said, "Get out. This is my wedding, not yours. If you can't respect my choices, then don't come." Bianca's laugh was sharp and cruel. Your choices? Cassandra, you're making a mistake marrying someone who'll keep you trapped in mediocrity forever. James is sweet, but he's not going places. Not real places. You could do so much better if you just stop settling. That night, I cried in James's arms until I had no tears left. Maybe she's right, I whispered against his chest. Maybe I am thinking too small. Maybe we should wait until we can afford something nicer. Hey, James lifted my chin so I had to look at him. I don't care if we get married in a parking lot with gas station flabbers. I just want to marry you. But if you want to wait, if you want something bigger, we'll wait. That's when Bianca struck. Over the next 2 weeks, she launched a subtle campaign against our relationship. She'd call me at work with articles about couples who rushed into marriage. She'd forward me social media posts about women who'd settled too early. She planted seeds of doubt with surgical precision. I heard James's attending physician mention he might not get the fellowship he wants, she mentioned casually during lunch. What happens to your future plans then? Mom thinks you should take some time to travel, see the world before you tie yourself down, she'd say, even though our mother had never said any such thing. The final blow came 3 weeks before the wedding. Bianca showed up at my apartment with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of wine, acting like the loving sister I'd always wanted her to be. I owe you an apology, she said, settling onto my tiny couch. I've been horrible about the wedding planning. I was just worried about you, but I went about it all wrong. For 2 hours, she was everything I'd missed, funny, supportive, genuinely interested in my happiness. She asked about my work, complimented the small changes I'd made to my apartment, even admitted she was jealous of how close James and I were. Robert and I barely talk anymore, she confessed. We have this beautiful life, but it feels empty sometimes. You and James have something real. I felt the walls I'd built around my heart starting to crumble. This was my sister, the girl who'd braided my hair and shared secrets with me when we were kids. Maybe I'd been too harsh. Then came the poison, delivered so sweetly I almost missed it. I just want you to be sure, she said, refilling my wine glass. Marriage is forever, or it should be. And with everything happening at James's hospital, what do you mean, everything happening? Bianca's eyes widened with practiced innocence. Oh, I thought you knew. Robert heard from someone at the medical board that there's going to be some major restructuring, budget cuts. They're letting go of a lot of residents who aren't performing at the top level. My stomach dropped. James had been stressed lately, working longer hours, but he hadn't mentioned anything about job security. I'm sure it's nothing, Bianca continued, but maybe it would be smart to postpone until things settle down. Give yourselves time to be certain about the future. That conversation haunted me for days. When I finally worked up the courage to ask James about the hospital situation, his pause before answering told me everything I needed to know. It's competitive, he admitted. There might be some changes. But Cass, that doesn't change how I feel about you, about us.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
But doubt had already taken root. What if Bianca was right? What if I was rushing into something that would trap us both in a life of financial struggle? What if postponing was the mature, responsible thing to do? The day I called the vendors to cancel everything was the worst day of my life. Mrs. Benedetto cried on the phone. The photographer, a young woman just starting her business, begged me to reconsider because she'd already turned down other jobs for our date. Each call felt like I was dismantling, not just a wedding, but my entire future. James took the news better than I'd expected, which somehow made it worse. If this is what you need, he said simply, then we'll wait. But I could see the hurt in his eyes, the way he pulled back from me just slightly. The easy intimacy we'd always shared became strained. He threw himself into work with new intensity, and I threw myself into extra shifts at the hospital, both of us avoiding the elephant in the room. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of awkward conversations and careful distance. 3 weeks of Bianca checking in with fake concern and real satisfaction. 3 weeks of me wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Then the invitations arrived. Standing in my apartment, holding the proof of the celebration I'd thrown away, I realized something with crystal clarity. Bianca had never canceled the invitations because she'd never intended for me to actually postpone the wedding permanently. She'd wanted me to doubt myself, to question my choices, to feel small and uncertain. But she'd underestimated me, and she definitely underestimated the power of a woman who just realized she'd been played. I stood there for what felt like hours, those invitations spread across my coffee table like evidence in a crime scene. Each one represented a person who'd been expecting to celebrate with James and me, people who probably thought I'd lost my mind for calling everything off so suddenly. My hands were shaking as I picked up my phone and scrolled to James's contact. He answered on the first ring, his voice tired from another 14-hour shift. "Cass, everything okay?" "The invitations came today," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Silence stretched between us, heavy with everything we hadn't said over the past 3 weeks. "I thought you canceled those." "I thought I did too, but apparently there was a miscommunication with the print shop." I took a deep breath. "James, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Always. Did Bianca ever contact you directly about the wedding? About us?" Another pause, longer this time. "Cass, please, just tell me." "She called me the week before you decided to postpone. She said she was worried about you, that you were having second thoughts but were too afraid to hurt my feelings. She suggested that maybe I should be the one to bring up waiting." My heart stopped. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that if you were having doubts, you'd talk to me yourself, that we didn't need her interference in our relationship." His voice grew stronger. "But then, when you came to me a few days later talking about postponing, I thought maybe she'd been right. Maybe you really were having second thoughts." I closed my eyes, the full scope of Bianca's manipulation finally becoming clear. She'd played us against each other, making each of us believe the other wanted to wait. "James, I never wanted to postpone the wedding. I let her get in my head, make me doubt everything good in my life." "What are you saying?" I looked at the invitations again, at the date that was now just 10 days away. "I'm saying I made the worst mistake of my life, and I want to fix it if it's not too late." The silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. Finally, he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you sure? Because I can't go through this again, Cass. If we do this, we're really doing this. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." "Then we have 10 days to put together a wedding." The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years and started making calls. Mrs. Benedetto wept when I asked if she could still make our cake. "Mia cara," she said through her tears, "I never stopped hoping you'd come back." The photographer was booked, but she knew someone just as talented who could step in. The botanical garden had been reserved by someone else, but the manager remembered us and offered the smaller rose garden at the same price. One by one, pieces fell into place with an ease that felt like the universe itself was conspiring to help us. The hardest call was to my mother. "Mija, what's going on?" she asked when I told her the wedding was back on. "Bianca said you and James were having problems." "Mom, did you ever tell Bianca you thought I should travel before getting married?" "What? No, of course not. I told her I was heartbroken when you canceled, that James was perfect for you, and I didn't understand what happened." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. I spent the next hour telling my mother everything, watching her shock turn to anger as she realized how thoroughly Bianca had manipulated the situation. "Tagada," she muttered in Spanish. "I raised her better than this." "Don't say anything to her yet," I begged. "I need to handle this my way." The week that followed was a blur of frantic preparation mixed with pure joy. James threw himself into the planning with an enthusiasm that made my heart soar. We hand-delivered new invitations to close family and friends, explaining that we'd had a change of heart about the timing. Most people were thrilled. A few couldn't make it on such short notice, but they sent their love and promised to celebrate with us later. The one person I didn't invite was Bianca. 3 days before the wedding, she showed up at my apartment unannounced. I opened the door to find her standing there with a large gift bag and her most winning smile. "Surprise! I thought you might need some help with last-minute preparations." "How did you know about the wedding?" Her smile faltered slightly. Mom mentioned you and James had worked things out. I'm so happy for you, Cass. I know I was difficult during the planning process, but I just wanted what was best for you. I stepped aside to let her in, my mind racing. She had no idea I knew about her phone call to James, about the lies she'd told about our mother's opinion, about any of it. To her, I was still the same naive little sister she could manipulate at will. That's very thoughtful of you, I said carefully. Though I'm surprised you support the decision now, considering how strongly you felt we should wait. Well, you know me. I just want you to be happy. She set the gift bag on my counter and started unpacking it. I brought some emergency wedding supplies: stain remover pen, safety pins, tissues for tears of joy. She paused and looked at me with what appeared to be genuine concern. You do seem happy, right? No more doubts? None at all. It's funny how clarity can come from the most unexpected places. Over the next hour, Bianca transformed back into the sister I'd always wanted. She helped me organize my wedding day timeline, offered to handle any last-minute emergencies, even volunteered to pick up the flowers the morning of the ceremony. It was like watching an actress slip into a familiar role, and I found myself almost admiring the performance. There's just one thing, she said as she was getting ready to leave. I hope you won't be upset, but I already had plans this weekend. Robert booked us a surprise trip to Martha's Vineyard for our anniversary. I tried to change it, but you know how he is about his schedule. I nodded sympathetically. Of course, don't worry about it. You're the best. She hugged me tightly. I'll make it up to you, I promise. Maybe we can do a belated celebration dinner next week? After she left, I sat in my apartment for a long time, processing what had just happened. Even now, even when I was giving her the chance to be a supportive sister, she was choosing to abandon me. The excuse about the anniversary trip was obviously fabricated. Bianca would never miss a social event as significant as a wedding, especially one where she could be seen as the magnanimous older sister. Unless, of course, she was hoping the wedding would fall apart again. That night, I called James and told him about Bianca's visit. She's not coming to the wedding, I said. She claims she has other plans. How do you feel about that? I considered the question seriously. A month ago, the idea of getting married without my sister there would have devastated me. Now, it felt like freedom. Relieved, honestly. I don't think I could handle wondering what she was thinking during our vows, whether she was judging every detail. Then we'll have a beautiful wedding without her. 2 days before the ceremony, I was at the hospital finishing my last shift before taking a week off for our honeymoon when my supervisor, Dr. Martinez, pulled me aside. Cassandra, I wanted to let you know how much we're going to miss you while you're gone, and congratulations again on the wedding. Thank you. I'm excited to get back and tell you all about it. Actually, there's something else I wanted to discuss with you. We've been impressed with your leadership during the recent changes in the department. How would you feel about taking on more administrative responsibilities? There's a charge nurse position opening up, and the pay increase would be substantial. I stared at her, stunned. Changes in the department? The restructuring. I know it's been stressful for everyone, worrying about job security, but you've handled everything beautifully. Dr. Martinez, I'm sorry, but what restructuring? I haven't heard anything about job security issues. She looked confused. The budget reallocations we announced 3 months ago? We had to eliminate some positions in other departments, but pediatrics was actually expanded. I thought everyone knew. My blood ran cold. 3 months ago was exactly when Bianca had started her campaign of doubt about James's job security. Were there any cuts in the cardiology residency program? Cardiology? No, they got additional funding for new equipment. Why? I managed to finish the conversation and my shift, but inside I was reeling. There had never been any threat to James's position. Bianca had fabricated the entire story, probably after a casual conversation with Robert where he'd mentioned general hospital budget discussions. That evening, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. I was going to confront my sister, but not in the way she'd expect. I drove to her penthouse and used my key, which she'd given me for emergencies. She wasn't home, but Robert was in his study working on his laptop. Cass, what a surprise. Bianca's at her yoga class. Actually, Robert, I was hoping to talk to you. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Is everything okay? Bianca mentioned you and James had some bumps leading up to the wedding. That's what I wanted to ask you about. She mentioned that you'd heard something about budget cuts affecting the cardiology department at James's hospital. Robert frowned. Budget cuts? No, I don't think so. I know they got new funding for some cardiac imaging equipment. Why? I managed to finish the conversation and my shift, but inside I was reeling. There had never been any threat to James's position. Bianca had fabricated the entire story, probably after a casual conversation with Robert where he'd mentioned general hospital budget discussions. That evening, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. I was going to confront my sister, but not in the way she'd expect. I drove to her penthouse and used my key, which she'd given me for emergencies. She wasn't home, but Robert was in his study working on his laptop. Cass, what a surprise. Bianca's at her yoga class. Actually, Robert, I was hoping to talk to you. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Is everything okay? Bianca mentioned you and James had some bumps leading up to the wedding. That's what I wanted to ask you about. She mentioned that you'd heard something about budget cuts affecting the cardiology department at James's hospital. Robert frowned. Budget cuts? No, I don't think so. I know they got new funding for some cardiac imaging equipment. Why? I managed to finish the conversation and my shift, but inside I was reeling. There had never been any threat to James's position. Bianca had fabricated the entire story, probably after a casual conversation with Robert where he'd mentioned general hospital budget discussions. That evening, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. I was going to confront my sister, but not in the way she'd expect. I drove to her penthouse and used my key, which she'd given me for emergencies. She wasn't home, but Robert was in his study working on his laptop. Cass, what a surprise. Bianca's at her yoga class. Actually, Robert, I was hoping to talk to you. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Is everything okay? Bianca mentioned you and James had some bumps leading up to the wedding. That's what I wanted to ask you about. She mentioned that you'd heard something about budget cuts affecting the cardiology department at James's hospital. Robert frowned. Budget cuts? No, I don't think so. I know they got new funding for some cardiac imaging equipment. Why? I explained the conversation I'd had with Bianca, watching Robert's expression grow increasingly uncomfortable. Cassandra, I think there might have been some miscommunication. I never said anything about James's job being at risk. What exactly did you tell Bianca about the hospital? He was quiet for a moment, clearly trying to remember. We were at a charity dinner, and someone mentioned that healthcare budgets were tight across the city. I made some general comment about how hospitals were having to make difficult decisions, but nothing specific, certainly nothing about cardiology. Another piece of the puzzle. Robert, can I ask you something else? Did you really book a surprise trip to Martha's Vineyard for this weekend? His confusion was genuine. Martha's Vineyard? No, we don't have any travel plans. We're having dinner with her book club friends Saturday night. Why would you think we were traveling? I left Robert's study with everything I needed to know. Bianca had constructed an elaborate web of lies, using half-truths and manipulations to sabotage my happiness. But tomorrow, James and I were getting married anyway, and my sister was about to learn that some games come with consequences she never saw coming. The morning of my wedding dawned crisp and clear, the kind of October day that makes you believe in fresh starts. I woke up in my childhood bedroom where I'd spent the night so my mother could help me get ready. The dress, hanging on my closet door, caught the early sunlight, and for the first time in months, I felt nothing but pure joy. James and I had decided to see each other before the ceremony for our first look photos. When I walked around the corner of the botanical garden and saw him standing there in his navy suit, his back to me, I couldn't help but smile. This was right. This had always been right. He turned when he heard my footsteps, and the expression on his face when he saw me made every moment of doubt worth it. Cassandra, he breathed, and I could see tears forming in his eyes. You're so beautiful. Don't make me cry yet, I laughed, reaching up to straighten his tie. We haven't even started. Our photographer captured everything. The way James couldn't stop touching my face like he was making sure I was real, how we kept breaking into laughter for no reason except pure happiness. These were the photos I'd treasure forever, the ones that showed who we really were when nobody else was watching. The ceremony itself was perfect in its simplicity.
43 people who truly loved us, sitting in wooden chairs arranged in a semicircle around the rose arbor where we'd exchange vows. Mrs. Benedetto had outdone herself with the cake, a 3-tier masterpiece covered in delicate sugar roses that matched my bouquet exactly. My mother walked me down the aisle, since my father had passed when I was in college, and I could feel her pride radiating beside me. James's entire family had made the trip from San Juan, his abuela wearing her best dress and clutching a rosary. This was what family was supposed to look like, people who showed up when it mattered. As James and I exchanged rings, I caught sight of a familiar figure near the garden entrance. My heart stopped. Bianca was there, partially hidden behind a large oak tree, wearing sunglasses despite the fact that we were under the shade of the rose arbor. She'd come after all, but she was lurking like a wedding crasher instead of taking her reserved seat in the front row. I squeezed James's hand, and he followed my gaze. When he spotted Bianca, his jaw tightened slightly, but he squeezed back reassuringly. We'll deal with whatever this was later. Right now, nothing else mattered except the promises we were making to each other. "Cassandra," James said, his voice carrying clearly over the small gathering. 3 weeks ago, I thought I lost you, not to another person, but to fear and doubt that I didn't know how to fight. Today, standing here, I want you to know that I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt how much you're loved, how much you're valued, how absolutely perfect you are exactly as you are.
I was crying before he finished, and when it was my turn to speak, my voice shook with emotion. James, you've never asked me to be anyone other than who I am. You've never made me feel like I needed to apologize for my dreams or my choices. You've shown me what it looks like when someone truly sees you and loves what they see. I promise to give you that same gift every day for the rest of our lives. When we kissed as husband and wife, the small crowd erupted in cheers and applause. I looked toward the oak tree, but Bianca was gone. The reception was everything I dreamed of. We danced to the same song that had been playing in that little Italian restaurant on our first date. James's cousin sang a beautiful version of At Last that left everyone in tears. My mother gave a speech about how proud she was of the woman I'd become, and James's father welcomed me into their family with words that made me understand where James got his generous heart. We were cutting the cake when Bianca finally made her official appearance. "I'm so sorry I'm late," she announced loudly as she swept into the reception area wearing a dress that was clearly more expensive than my entire wedding budget. Traffic was absolutely horrible coming back from the vineyard. The entire reception fell silent. I could feel 42 pairs of eyes watching this interaction, including my mother's, who was standing behind Bianca with an expression I'd never seen before. "Bianca," I said calmly, setting down the cake knife, "I thought you couldn't make it." "Well, you know me. I couldn't miss my baby sister's special day." She air-kissed my cheeks and turned to James. "Congratulations, James. You're getting an amazing woman." "I know," he replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Thanks for coming." Bianca surveyed the reception with what she probably thought was subtle assessment, but everyone could see her cataloging details. The string lights we'd hung ourselves, the centerpieces made from flowers my mother had arranged, the simple white tablecloths instead of elaborate linens. "This is so charming," she said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Very rustic chic. I love how you've embraced the budget aesthetic." Mrs. Benedetto, who was standing nearby with her husband, straightened her shoulders. Several of James's relatives exchanged glances. But before anyone else could respond, my mother stepped forward. "Bianca, could I have a word with you privately?" I watched my sister's face change as she registered something in our mother's tone. "Of course, Mommy. Let me just grab some of this adorable cake first." "Now," my mother said firmly. They walked toward the edge of the garden, and I could see them having what appeared to be an intense conversation. Bianca's body language grew increasingly defensive, while my mother's remained steady and authoritative. When they returned 10 minutes later, Bianca looked like she'd been crying. "I need to apologize," she said, approaching James and me. "I've been a terrible sister, and I owe you both an explanation." The reception had mostly resumed its festive atmosphere, but I could sense people listening. This isn't the time or place, Bianca. Yes, it is, she insisted, because if I don't say this now, I'll lose my nerve. She took a shaky breath. I was jealous of what you two have. I convinced myself that if I could make you doubt your relationship, maybe you'd understand what it felt like to have everything look perfect from the outside, but feel empty inside. James moved closer to me, his arm around my waist. Why would you want that for Cassandra? Because misery loves company, she said simply. Because watching you two be genuinely happy made me realize how unhappy I am. That's not an excuse, it's just the truth. I stared at my sister, seeing her clearly for maybe the first time in years. Behind the designer clothes and perfect makeup, she looked exhausted. Bianca, why didn't you just talk to me? We used to tell each other everything. When? When you were working double shifts and I was at charity galas? When you were planning a life with someone who adored you and I was scheduling couples therapy sessions that Robert kept canceling? She wiped her eyes, smearing her mascara. I didn't know how to tell you that your little sister's life was everything I wished mine could be. The honesty in her voice caught me off guard. This wasn't the calculated manipulation I'd expected. It was raw pain from someone who'd been pretending to be happy for so long she'd forgotten what the real thing felt like. What you did was wrong, I said quietly. You almost destroyed the best thing in my life because you were unhappy with yours. I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you if you'll let me. I looked at James, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Then I looked at my mother, whose expression had softened from anger to sadness. Finally, I looked back at Bianca, my complicated, flawed, hurting sister. You can start by getting some real help. Not couples therapy that Robert dictates, but actual therapy for yourself. Figure out what you want your life to look like instead of sabotaging other people's happiness. She nodded eagerly. I already have an appointment scheduled for next week. And you need to apologize to Mrs. Benedetto, who cried when she thought she wouldn't get to make our cake because of your comments. Bianca glanced over at the elderly woman, who was watching our conversation with obvious concern. Of course, immediately. And if you ever, and I mean ever, try to manipulate my marriage again, we're done. Not as sisters, not as family, done completely. Do you understand? I understand. I studied her face, looking for signs of the performance I'd grown accustomed to, but all I saw was genuine remorse and exhaustion. Okay then, go apologize to Mrs. Benedetto, and then you can stay for dinner, but this conversation happens again later when we can really talk. The rest of the evening passed peacefully. Bianca apologized profusely to Mrs. Benedetto, who graciously accepted and insisted she try a piece of the cake. She sat quietly at a back table, not trying to insert herself into conversations or make the evening about her drama. For the first time in years, she seemed content to just be present without being the center of attention. As James and I danced our last dance as newlyweds, I caught sight of her talking quietly with our mother. They were both crying, but it looked like the kind of crying that comes with relief rather than pain. No regrets, James whispered in my ear as we swayed to the music. I looked around at our reception, at Mrs. Benedetto sharing cake with James's grandmother, at my coworkers laughing with his medical school friends, at my mother and sister finally having what looked like an honest conversation, at the string lights twinkling overhead and the simple flowers that somehow looked exactly right. Only one, I said. His smile faded slightly. What's that? I regret that I let fear make me doubt this even for a second. I regret that I almost threw away the best thing that ever happened to me because someone else couldn't recognize good when she saw it. James spun me around slowly, and when I came back into his arms, he was grinning. Well, we have about 60 years to make up for 3 weeks of doubt. Think that's enough time? I kissed him right there on the dance floor, in front of everyone, not caring who was watching or what anyone thought. It's a good start. 6 months later, Bianca and I had coffee every Sunday morning at Mrs. Benedetto's bakery. She'd started individual therapy and was slowly learning to build a life that made her happy instead of one that just looked impressive. Robert had initially resisted her changes, but when faced with the choice between supporting his wife's growth or losing her entirely, he'd surprised everyone by choosing love. And me? I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's living so well that the people who tried to bring you down realize what they almost cost themselves in the process. I stared at my sister, seeing her clearly for maybe the first time in years. Behind the designer clothes and perfect makeup, she looked exhausted. Bianca, why didn't you just talk to me? We used to tell each other everything. When? When you were working double shifts and I was at charity galas? When you were planning a life with someone who adored you and I was scheduling couples therapy sessions that Robert kept canceling? She wiped her eyes, smearing her mascara. I didn't know how to tell you that your little sister's life was everything I wished mine could be. The honesty in her voice caught me off guard. This wasn't the calculated manipulation I'd expected. It was raw pain from someone who'd been pretending to be happy for so long she'd forgotten what the real thing felt like. What you did was wrong, I said quietly. You almost destroyed the best thing in my life because you were unhappy with yours. I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you if you'll let me. I looked at James, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Then I looked at my mother, whose expression had softened from anger to sadness. Finally, I looked back at Bianca, my complicated, flawed, hurting sister. You can start by getting some real help. Not couples therapy that Robert dictates, but actual therapy for yourself. Figure out what you want your life to look like instead of sabotaging other people's happiness. She nodded eagerly. I already have an appointment scheduled for next week. And you need to apologize to Mrs. Benedetto, who cried when she thought she wouldn't get to make our cake because of your comments. Bianca glanced over at the elderly woman, who was watching our conversation with obvious concern. Of course, immediately. And if you ever, and I mean ever, try to manipulate my marriage again, we're done. Not as sisters, not as family, done completely. Do you understand? I understand. I studied her face, looking for signs of the performance I'd grown accustomed to, but all I saw was genuine remorse and exhaustion. Okay then, go apologize to Mrs. Benedetto, and then you can stay for dinner. But this conversation happens again later when we can really talk. The rest of the evening passed peacefully. Bianca apologized profusely to Mrs. Benedetto, who graciously accepted. James still brings me coffee in bed every morning, just like he did when we were dating. We still go to Mrs. Benedetto's for pastry every Sunday, though now Bianca often joins us. And those wedding invitations that started this whole mess, they're framed in our kitchen, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments lead to the most beautiful discoveries about who you really are and what you're truly fighting for. 2 years after our wedding, James finished his cardiology residency and was offered a position at one of the most prestigious cardiac surgery programs on the West Coast. The opportunity meant relocating to Seattle, leaving behind the life we'd built in New York, but it also meant James could pursue his dream of pediatric cardiac surgery. It's your decision, I told him as we sat in our small Queens apartment, the job offer spread across our kitchen table. I can find nursing work anywhere. Our decision, he corrected. We're a team, remember? Within 3 months, we'd packed up our entire life and moved across the country. I found a position at Seattle Children's Hospital, working in the same unit where James would eventually operate. The symmetry felt like destiny. Our new apartment had a view of Elliott Bay and enough space for the home office I'd always dreamed of. I'd been taking online business courses in my spare time, fascinated by the intersection of healthcare and technology. James encouraged me to pursue an MBA, even offering to take on extra shifts to cover the tuition costs. You've supported my dreams, he said. Now it's your turn. I enrolled in the evening program at the University of Washington, studying healthcare administration and innovation. My thesis project focused on developing technology solutions to improve communication between pediatric patients and their medical teams. What started as an academic exercise quickly became something more. The app I created used simple visual interfaces and gamification to help children understand their medical conditions and treatment plans. Instead of being passive recipients of care, kids could track their progress, ask questions through the platform, and even connect with other young patients facing similar challenges. My professor encouraged me to enter the concept in a university-sponsored startup competition. I almost didn't do it, worried that my idea wasn't sophisticated enough compared to the blockchain and cryptocurrency projects other students were developing. James convinced me otherwise.
You see problems that other people miss because you actually work with these kids every day. That's not a weakness, it's your superpower. The night of the competition, I stood on stage in front of a panel of judges that included venture capitalists, successful entrepreneurs, and tech industry leaders. My hands shook as I launched into my presentation, but as I talked about 8-year-old Maria, who'd been terrified of her heart surgery until she could visualize it through my app, my nervousness faded. Healthcare technology often focuses on efficiency for providers or cost reduction for insurers, I concluded. But what if we focused on empowerment for patients? What if we gave children agency in their own healing process? I won first place and a $50,000 seed grant. The local news covered the competition, and within a week, I was fielding calls from children's hospitals across the country wanting to pilot the program. Seattle Children's became our beta site, and within 6 months, patient anxiety scores in our pediatric units had dropped by 40%. That's when the real offers started coming in. A major healthcare technology company wanted to buy my app for $2 million. A Silicon Valley venture capital firm offered to fund a full-scale launch with me as CEO. Multiple children's hospitals wanted exclusive licensing deals. I was overwhelmed by the options until James sat me down one evening after his shift. What do you actually want, Cassandra? Not what sounds impressive or what other people think you should do. What feels right to you? I thought about Maria and the hundreds of other children I'd worked with over the years. I thought about the fear in their eyes when they faced medical procedures they didn't understand, and how that fear transformed into curiosity and even excitement when they could engage with their treatment through my platform. I want to help kids, I said simply. I want to build something that matters. Then build it. Instead of selling to the highest bidder, I negotiated a licensing model that would make the technology available to any pediatric facility regardless of their budget. Wealthy hospitals would pay premium rates that would subsidize free access for community hospitals and clinics in underserved areas. Within 18 months, KidCare Connect was being used in over 200 hospitals nationwide. The app had evolved beyond my original concept, incorporating features for family communication, medical team coordination, and even integration with electronic health records. My mother called me crying the day Forbes featured me in their 30 Under 30 Healthcare Innovators list. Mija, I'm so proud of you. Your father would be so proud. But the call that meant the most came from an unexpected source. Cassandra, it's Bianca. I just saw the article about your company in the Wall Street Journal. I hadn't spoken to my sister in months. After our reconciliation at the wedding, we'd maintained a cordial relationship, but the geographic distance had made regular contact difficult. Her marriage to Robert had stabilized after therapy, and she'd started her own interior design business in Manhattan. I wanted to tell you something, she continued. I've been volunteering at a children's hospital here in New York, helping them redesign their patient rooms to be more kid-friendly. The staff told me about this amazing app they'd just implemented that was helping their young patients feel more comfortable and engaged. I smiled, already knowing where this was going. It was your app, wasn't it? KidCare Connect? It was. Cassandra, watching these children use your technology, seeing how it transforms their entire experience, I finally understand what you've been building. You didn't just create a successful business, you created something that actually matters. We talked for over an hour that night, really talked in a way we hadn't since we were teenagers. Bianca told me about the fulfillment she'd found in using her design skills to create healing environments for children. I told her about my plans to expand internationally and develop specialized modules for different types of pediatric care. I have a confession, she said near the end of our conversation. When you canceled the wedding initially, part of me was relieved. I thought it proved that you were making the same mistakes I had, choosing security over passion, settling for less than you deserved. And now? Now I realize I had it completely backwards. You weren't settling for James, you were choosing the partner who would help you become the person you were meant to be. And I was so focused on the external markers of success that I almost convinced you to throw away the foundation of everything you've built. 6 months later, James and I flew back to New York for the opening of the newly redesigned pediatric wing at Mount Sinai, a project Bianca had led in collaboration with the KidCare Connect team. The rooms were bright and welcoming, with interactive walls that integrated seamlessly with my app's interface. At the opening ceremony, I watched Bianca explain the design choices to a group of hospital administrators and donors. She spoke passionately about the psychological impact of environment on healing, the importance of making medical spaces feel safe rather than sterile, and how technology could enhance rather than replace human connection in healthcare settings. My sister taught me that innovation isn't about impressing people with complexity, she said, gesturing toward me in the audience. It's about seeing problems that others overlook and having the courage to solve them in simple human ways. After the event, the three of us went to dinner at that same Italian restaurant where James and I had our first date. Mrs. Benedetto's niece now ran the place, and she remembered us from our wedding cake consultations years earlier. "You know what's funny?" Bianca said as we shared tiramisu for dessert. "I spent so many years thinking success meant having the most expensive things, the most impressive title, the most enviable lifestyle. But sitting here, watching you two talk about the kids whose lives you're changing, I realize I had no idea what success actually looked like." James reached over and squeezed my hand. "Success looks different for everyone." "Maybe," Bianca agreed, "but happiness looks pretty universal, and you two have always had that figured out." As we walked back to our hotel that night, James stopped suddenly and pulled me into his arms right there on the sidewalk. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd actually gone through with canceling our wedding permanently?" I thought about the question seriously. I think we would have found our way back to each other eventually. We're too stubborn to let other people's doubts derail us forever. Even if it took years? Even then, some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight is against your own fears. He kissed me under the streetlights, and for a moment, I was transported back to that scared 28-year-old nurse who'd almost let someone else's insecurity destroy her future. The woman I'd become felt like a completely different person, but the love I felt for this man had remained constant through every transformation. Today, KidCare Connect operates in over 40 countries. We've helped more than 1 million children navigate their healthcare journeys with less fear and more understanding. James runs the pediatric cardiac surgery program at Seattle Children's and consults on my app's medical accuracy and child development features. Bianca's design firm specializes in healthcare environments, and we collaborate regularly on projects that integrate physical space design with digital patient engagement tools. She and Robert adopted twin girls last year, and watching her become a mother has shown me a gentleness in her that I'd never seen before. The wedding invitations that started this whole journey are still framed in our kitchen, but now they share wall space with photos from our travels, awards for the app, pictures from young patients who've used our technology. Sometimes I think about the alternate timeline where I actually stayed canceled, where fear won over love, where other people's limitations became my own. In that world, I'm probably still working night shifts in a Queen's hospital, dating men who don't understand my ambitions, wondering why I feel so empty despite having everything that's supposed to matter. But in this world, the real world, I learned that the most dangerous prison is the one built from other people's small dreams for your life. The most courageous thing you can do is refuse to live inside those walls, even when the people building them claim to love you. Especially then. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass.